We're back on the road to Reykjavik with Bobby Fischer, and it's his quarterfinal candidates match against Mark Taimanov. Now, so far we've looked at the first three games. Fischer won them all, and, well, Taimanov was in a state of shock, and he was actually hospitalised with high blood pressure. But he was back for game four, and arguably this is the best game of the match. So game four of the quarterfinal candidates match, Fischer against Taimanov. Let's take a look. Fischer with the white pieces, and Taimanov plays his very own opening, the Taimanov variation of the Sicilian. This is more solid than other lines like the Najdorf or maybe the Dragon, because basically black engages in a fight in the centre right from the word go, and develops pieces pretty sensibly. Fischer played this G3 variation, which I think is a good solid setup for white, because this bishop protects the pawn on e4, which is sometimes weak. I have to say I've always really enjoyed playing this setup with white, because actually it's quite a positional way of meeting black's opening. You don't get involved in some kind of do or die struggle. It's just very sensible. And here Taimanov exchanges on d4, which is definitely the most reliable way of playing with black here, and enables black to develop the king side very easily. And here's a little finesse from white. Instead of retreating the queen straight away, first of all you flick in bishop f4. This endgame after the exchange of queens, definitely a bit better for white. So Taimanov plays d6, this is normal, and only then the queen drops back, but you can see the bishop isn't on c1, it's already out on f4, so this is a harmonious way to develop. And now, before playing e5, black plays h6 to prevent bishop g5, which would knock out the knight, and rook d1. So you can see that white is ahead in development, but black is solid in the middle of the board. Backward d pawn, but actually it's not such a big deal in this position. Taimanov said afterwards, tune-up sessions had prepared me for this position. It seemed more or less problem-free for black. Fischer, however, took a different view. Alas, it proved to be correct. That's Taimanov, quoted in Russians versus Fischer. This is a superb book, actually. Very, very interesting book about the Soviet reaction to Fischer's rise and how they tried to cope with him. Lots of old Soviet archive material collected in that book. You can still find, I don't think it's still in print, but you can find it online. So bishop g4, hitting the rook. Fischer exchanges on c5, and this is the point that black can recapture with the pawn. So this pawn is an emprise, and now white deals with this threat by playing f3, and the bishop drops back to e6. So you can see what I mean by, this is a sensible way for black to play, because black is engaged in the middle right from the word go, and this bishop is on a good solid square, and really the only way for white to make progress in this position is to throw the knight in on d5. Modern practice has shown that castles is probably the best move here, but Taimanov went rook d8, and he has a specific idea in mind, attacking the queen. So here we go, knight d5. This is important. Black can't live with that knight on d5. And now e4. So this is Taimanov's idea that he's cutting off the bishop's protection for the pawn on d5. Now it is possible to play c4 here, but then black would castle and he can hang on to the pawn on e4. But Fischer goes for something else. He plays, instead of c4, he plays rook e1. Wants to get rid of that pawn. And now this leads, practically by force, to an exchange of pieces. Taimanov gets rid of that potentially dangerous passed pawn. Fischer takes the pawn on e4. So if knight takes rook, then there's queen takes rook, and that obviously is very good for white. But king d8 was played, which looks pretty weird to leave the king in the centre, but actually black can get away with this because there are forced exchanges coming up. So first of all, the queen is attacked and rooks exchanged. And now here's the point, that with this next move, queen d7, black can force an exchange of queens, because obviously if the queen moves, then knight takes rook. So white has to trade on d7. Now, I can imagine that Taimanov would have had this position in his home analysis, actually, because of these forced exchanges. And probably thought, well, you know, it's a fairly level position. Obviously white can try here because white has a bishop, but it shouldn't be too difficult to hold this. But, well, again, this is Taimanov writing in this book, or quoted in this book, Russians versus Fischer. In what followed, I felt like Dr. Watson, who could only play along and admire the resourcefulness and imagination of the great Sherlock Holmes. Okay, well, let's see how Fischer, or alias Sherlock Holmes, managed to bamboozle Taimanov in this endgame. And this is really impressive technique, textbook technique. Rook e5, attacking the pawn but also opening up the bishop's diagonal, so therefore b6, alright, nothing special there. This next move from Fischer starts a really nice maneuver, bishop f1. Rook is doing a great job on the 5th rank, by the way. Controlling these squares, controlling the knight square here. So the bishop attacks the pawn. Now, already a slightly uncomfortable moment for black, because you can't play b5 because the pawn here would be on prise. You don't really want to play rook a8. You have to play a5. Yeah, I mean, if rook a8, then the bishop comes to c4. And that is very awkward, as in the game. So a5, but it's not a beautiful move, because it means that these squares are now available for white's bishop, and later on white's king as well. That's a spoiler for you. Bishop c4. I mean, in some ways it can be good to get the pawns on the opposite colour to the bishop. There are certain defensive formations that black can use to defend, but as we'll see, there are massive drawbacks to this as well. So these last few moves, excellent little steps from Fischer. So now this rook is having to defend this measly pawn on f7. Now, nice and steady for white here. King g2. White's plan is just to improve the position little by little. The next step is really to advance the king up the board and to perhaps squeeze with his own pawns on the king's side. Interesting thought would be perhaps to put the knight on d6. As we'll see, it can be useful to have the knight on d6 to cover these light squares. But let's just see what happens if knight e8, just very quickly. Then we can check the king and actually this is extremely uncomfortable for black, because if the king comes here, then we can give a check. So the king goes back. Now let's just get out of trouble, because there's potentially a knight fork here. And you can see, well, basically it's not possible to put the knight on this key square d6. So after this, let's just see the bishop and rook working beautifully together. And well, we've seen this kind of thing in a few games recently. We've had an octopus knight that dominates the rooks, the enemy rooks, and this bishop, I'm not going to call it an octopus bishop, I'll have to think of another term. Well, perhaps you'd like to make some suggestions for how we should term this bishop, how we should describe this bishop, which also does a superb job of locking out black's rook in this position. It can't come to e8. On d8, well, it has no effect because the rook covers the bishop. And the bishop also, you can see, actually shuts out black's king as well. What a superb piece. And now here, f5 stops the knight coming to e6 and prepares just a beautiful squeeze on the king side, advancing the king behind those pawns. And black is in massive trouble in this position. Okay, let's come back here. So that was this move, knight e8. Back to the game, king d6. And now just a gentle squeeze, just bringing the king up the board. The rook has to come back. Very unfortunate for that rook that has to control the pawn. And if the pawn advances, that's no good, because then we can check. And then the rook reaches the 7th rank, and that is terrible for black. Taimanov played knight b8, trying to improve the position of that knight. I mean, who knows, maybe it should have gone back to f6, but it's very hard to suggest big improvements for black in this position, because there are chronic weaknesses in black's position, and this bishop and the rook really dominate black's pieces in this position. And again, nothing dramatic, little by little. Very important move. c3 is important to cover these squares, because this knight comes to c6, but, well, that knight is basically dominated, or at least it's controlled by the pawns. Rook comes back to e3, and now an important move, a4, fixing those pawns on the queen side. And that is important, as we'll see a little bit later. Knight e7. Now here, I think it would be tempting just to start the squeeze, particularly when the knight comes to e7. How many of us would throw in g4 here? Well, I don't think it's a bad move, but it's at this moment I think Fischer shows admirable restraint. He simply plays h3. So he's waiting to see how black sets up in this position. Black still can't move that rook. It's almost like a minor Zugzwang position here. Of course, black has many moves, but according to how black positions the pieces, then Fischer will decide whether to maneuver with the rook and bishop, or maybe press with the pawns. So this knight comes back to c6, and Fischer decides not to advance the g-pawn, but goes for the h-pawn instead. Now, it could be that he wanted to keep that square available for the king, for example. Could be he just wants to put the pawn on h5 and then decide what to do. He might go for g4, g5. He might bring the king in. Well, just depends. But anyway, h4 played, and Taimanov felt that he had to stop the kingside expansion with h5, and that may, in time, perhaps give the knight squares here. But let's see. There is, of course, a massive drawback with putting the pawn on a light square. Let's see. Check. and rook d5. So this begins the process of tempting black's pawns onto these light squares. F5 played to shut out the rook, but now the rook came back. At least black's rook has a little bit more freedom now, but you've got to be concerned about these pawns. Just gentle manoeuvring from Fischer. Now this starts a little idea, this rook coming to e3, because the king is going to find its way to the queen side. So yeah, I mean basically once this pawn, once the h pawn advanced, I think it was inevitable that these pawns were going to have to find their way to these squares as well in order to protect the h pawn. And now Fischer exchanges rooks. And this next part of the game is absolutely beautiful. Now here Fischer played bishop to e8 to keep black's knight on protecting the g-pawn basically. Let me just show you what happens if white plays really ineptly. This is really the one defensive idea that black has. So I'm just going to shuffle with the king, and just to show you what black on a really good day might be able to achieve. This is already a draw actually, because I've allowed the knight to come to d6 and it's completely drawn. You can see that the knight controls these light squares. Well, obviously that square was controlled as well. The key square is c4, and this pawn covers the square here. So basically black's pieces form a barrier in the center of the board, and there is nothing that white can do here. Basically that king cannot gain entry into the position, and this bishop can't attack these pawns. So basically the king can shuffle back and forth. Even if white breaks with b4, black simply ignores that, just keeps that pawn on c5, and there is no way through for white's king. Of course, Fischer understood this. Well, bishop e8, so that ties the knight to defending g6, which means that it's impossible for this knight to find a better square, and also, of course, makes room for the king to enter into the queen side. King d5, of course, that gets checked back. So the knight can't move because it has to protect the pawn on g6. The king tries to block out white's king, but of course that gets checked away. And the king steps in again. Okay, be careful. That knight would like to deliver checkmate, but don't fear, we give a check. And bishop d5. So the king now has a square on a6. Taimanov now played knight e7. Let's just see what happens if black plays actively. So knight d6 check. Obviously king a6. And now knight e4. Of course this had to be calculated quite carefully, but actually white is completely winning in this scenario. After this and here. And black is now in a Zugzwang position. So let's just see if knight e2, then we have this exchange, and let's just show this. Basically the knight has to fall back here. And all we need to do is put black in Zugzwang. We can do this very easily. You can see black's king can't move. King can't move because the pawn would be en prise. Now, let's just do this. Bishop here. And here's the crunch position. Bang. So after losing the move with the bishop, we managed to get to this key position where the knight can't move. The king only has one square, and that's to come here. And then the king comes in. We squeeze the king out of the way. And we take on b6. Well, a long variation, but actually very, very straightforward. Let's come back here. So that's what happens if black plays actively. So knight e7 played. And the bishop resumes its role of attacking the g-pawn. And now we have to get black in Zugzwang again, and we can do that. Again, some crafty maneuvering with the bishop. Now, if king a7, again, this is a Zugzwang position. We play c4. If the king steps back, we take the pawn, and if knight here, then the king comes in and heads for the g-pawn. So after bishop f3 check, we play king c7, and now the king marches in. Now we just have to get the bishop back to f7. If knight d6, then c4 wins. Black will have to go in for this again, and we know that's winning for white. So knight e7. And we get our Zugzwang position. Bishop e8. So if the king moves away from the pawn, obviously we take it, and the knight has to keep protecting here. So the only thing for black to do is to play the king here. Now, if the bishop goes back, then black is able to defend. But in this case, Fischer gives up the bishop. And the king can take a third pawn. And that really is the end. You can see that it's very unfortunate for this knight. It's an extra piece, but actually it's completely dominated. It's so far from any kind of useful square. And this is a very simple procedure. These pawns are just going through. Obviously, if this is taken, then the a pawn rolls through. And in this case, this is also not very pleasant. Yeah, again, black is just too slow to take here because the pawns will go through. And, well, in any case, this knight is actually dominated by the king because it can't come to these useful squares. And this pawn is going through. I mean, this is just a sublime performance from Bobby Fischer. For me, definitely the best game in the match. What can I say? It's just fantastic. If you want to see more games from this match, and indeed more games from Fischer, then do check out the playlist. You'll find that in the description down there, and probably in the info tab up there. And remember, if you want to support us, then do check out the links to PayPal or patreon.com, and you'll be able to contribute to the running costs of the channel. Thanks for watching.